One day I'll find a conspiracy thriller archaeology book with a good story, good writing and good characters. Today is not that day. The Babylon Rite is a conspiracy thriller concerned with the Knights Templar and a pre-Columbian tribe from Peru called the Moche. The story begins with various deaths. A published historian and scholar crashes his car into the side of a chapel after revoking his previous skepticism. A truck destroys a museum in Peru, including its collection of Moche artefacts. And a man in London is found dead, with his feet and one hand missing. Adam, ex-journalist of The Guardian, is thrown into a wild chase of the truth of the Templars, along with Nina, a daughter of the dead historian. Meanwhile, after a new Moche tomb is opened in Peru, anthropologist Jess makes discoveries of her own. And at the centre of everything is a secret that could get you killed. There's also a load of sexy ceramics, which is new. So yeah, the usual fare for this oddly specific genre. Self-aware, as the opening does explicitly mention Dan Brown's Da Vinci Code, but there's still nothing new here. I don't really know why I keep picking these up, as they're all the same, but I can't help it. I love this sort of nonsense, but maybe not this sort of nonsense. As always with these books, I enjoyed most of the story and the conspiracy. I thought there was some good anchoring of the conspiracy to real historical events and sources, which makes it seem plausible-ish. If you don't look too closely, that is, or if you're not already an expert in that field. For the most part, this does it okay. The people who know me know I love a good proper MacGuffin, so all of the physical things, the ancient carvings, the ceramics, the tombs, was stellar. Great, loved that. And I also always appreciate a book that takes us to different locations. And in here we had Scotland, England, France, Spain, Portugal and Peru. So I like that. A few issues, so bear with. Firstly, the pacing was off. It's very slow to begin with and oddly boring. Adam and Nina in Scotland were doing stuff but to little end, which made them boring, and Jess was just kind of faffing around without actively looking for anything, which made her boring. I was only invested in the story of Mark Ibsen, who's a police detective, because he was at least investigating a crime, looking for clues, piecing it all together. But his sections were obviously those of a minor character, so you knew that it wasn't going to follow through the entire story. It was just right at the beginning. In the middle it did pick up, but arguably started going too fast as Adam and Nina jumped wildly from place to place, but never really found very much apart from vague carvings, which was dull, but speedily dull. Secondly, the characters were hard to get invested in. I didn't really feel like we ever got to know any of them on a personal basis. Like, they didn't really have any personalities, just a series of bullet points to define them. Nina is Scottish and beautiful and has an alcohol problem and constantly angst about her dead father. Jess is a hypochondriac and constantly angst about her dead dad. Adam is a journalist and has anger issues and constantly angst about his dead girlfriend. Angsting over dead people is not a personality trait. I was also super disappointed with Adam because at first he was introduced as a journalist and I thought, excellent, perhaps this will be a slightly more refined, subtler protagonist. Sure, he gets fired from The Guardian for punching someone, and he probably deserved it. But then he turns into basically Diet Jack Reacher, as all protagonists in these books tend to do eventually. He's 6'2", he's built like a rugby player, he'll beat you up if you look at him funny, and it's just really boring. And it's also pointless because he barely ever uses these physical abilities to do anything apart from beat up that one guy in Portugal, which has no bearing on the plot whatsoever. So it just made him kind of dull and I was very disappointed. Thirdly, the violence and death and sex was a bit over the top. There's a very fine line between brutally effective and tediously gratuitous, and Tom Knox has completely ignored this line. And this isn't me being squeamish, it was just unpleasant, and one got the impression that the author was a little too much into writing these scenes to the detriment of the historical research and actual plot. Fourthly, the writing was atrocious, punctuation was everywhere, commas thrown about randomly, repetitive, questionable similes used at times, and so many random italics and ellipses. Didn't like it. Fifthly, there is a serious telling over showing issue. So much of the "as you know, John" dialogue and multiple uses of the whole "so let me get this straight" opener, which is fine, like once, but even then it's painful. It's one of those techniques that really shows the mechanics of a book, which you don't want to do. A good piece of art shouldn't make it obvious how it was put together, if that makes sense. You shouldn't be able to see the hand of the author, but reading this felt like that hand was smacking you repeatedly in the face. Sixthly, the bit at the beginning about the real places and events mentioned in the book, so this sort of author's note, was disappointingly short and only touched on a couple of locations, making me suspicious that this isn't as anchored in reality as I would have liked. Also, one of the locations is near me, but in the actual book, the characters barely spent a page there. Seventhly, the book is not smart enough to talk about serious topics like suicide and sexual assault. Don't do it. Eighthly, why is the author so negative in all his descriptions of Peru? He calls the landscape evil. What did Peru ever do to you? Ninthly, why is London so snowy in December? It's London. Aside from the freak weather this year, London is lucky to get an hour or so of sleet in February, not snow in December, and certainly not snow so heavy it impedes vision. The author actually lives in London. Does he just never look outside? Or is it just so expensive now that he can't afford a window? I don't know what's going on there. Tenthly, the story didn't really make any sense. So, spoilers and all that. So the big reveal is that it's drugs, because apparently it's always drugs these days. Zootopia, House of Earth and Blood, and now this. The Moche, and apparently all Meso and South American tribes, which isn't a generalisation at all had a drug that sent them into a crazed bloodlust, hence all the brutal murder and bloody rituals and disturbing sexy ceramics. The Knights Templar got a hold of this drug through the Vikings, who had landed in America, and used it to become the Berserker Warriors, which is a little tenuous, as the earliest mentions of berserkers are about 200 years before the Vikings even reached America. The Scottish professor found out and managed to obtain the drug. He sold some of it to a drug cartel and kept the rest for himself to commit suicide more easily as he was dying of terminal illness. Aside from the Viking issue, it doesn't really make any sense as to how the Scottish professor, I can't remember his name, managed to work out it was a drug and then get the drug. Adam and Nina only really work at the Templar link to Peru through following his footsteps to see where he went and work out how long he spent in places, but not why he went to Peru. I don't understand how he realised Peru was important. They only know it's Peru because he went to Peru and had a bit of sexy ceramics from Peru, and I don't know why he went to Peru at all. It wasn't mentioned, or if it was mentioned, it wasn't explained very well. The Knights Templar link is also pretty pointless, as Jess works it all out without needing to use the Templar to see it, so it's not as if they had to follow clues left by the Templar to work it out. Jess only realised it was a drug because she suddenly realised two words sounded similar or something. I don't know, it was kind of random. And then the idea of the Templar having the drug is also not particularly believable. So we know the Templar never made it to America. We know the Vikings did make it to America, and that is basically as far as this theory goes before it just completely leaves the rails. So let's look at some dates, because I love dates. So the Knights Templar were founded in about 1119 and disbanded in about 1307. The Viking era is contestable, but generally accepted as being around 793 to 1066, ending with the death of Harold Hardrada. Already we see a bit of gapping between the end of the Vikings and the beginning of the Templar, but that's fine, because Viking influences remained long after 1066, so maybe the Templar did find some secret Viking drug that allowed them to become berserkers. Why not? I'll buy that, I guess. So the Vikings got these drugs from South America. The only two peoples really mentioned are the Moche in Peru and the Aztecs in Mexico. And also the people who came after the Moche, but I forgot their names. I'll find it. So let's add their dates to this timeline. The Moche were around 100 to 750, and the Aztecs around 1300 to 1521. We can stop worrying about the Aztecs straight away because they're too late to have a bearing on anything, but we should be discounting the Moche as they were too early. But again, their influences remain in this new tribe that I've forgotten the name of. And other tribes existed who must have known about the Moche, so it's all fine. The Norse reached Newfoundland in around 985-ish, and I think were gone from America by about 1410. So this is the Norse, not necessarily the Vikings. But Newfoundland is in America, which is a bit too far away from Peru to really be significant, and I can find no official sources to support them ever reaching South America. Also, as berserkers I mentioned before the Vikings reached America, it's unlikely that's where they obtained the drug from. Thus crumbles the cornerstone of this book. There is no way the Templars could have got a hold of this South American drug. It just doesn't make any sense. And that's from a few basic Google searches. Some people who type into Google Vikings in South America might come across 3 pieces of evidence on the contrary. The Bunso sheepdog, the Norse temple in Tacuati in Paraguay, and the Great White King Ipir. Unfortunately, the only mentions of these are in comments on blog posts, and the only source I can actually find is a Spanish language book called El Rey Vikingo del Paraguay by Jacques de Mahieu. Was a neo-Nazi who doesn't appear to be taken particularly seriously by the historical community. And no other sources mention this dog, this temple, or this king, at least that I could find, and I wasn't willing to go into too much detail for a book I didn't really like. So what does all this prove? First and foremost, the links in this book are just too tenuous. I think most people would look at the suggested events, the Vikings go to America, find the South and Central American drug, take it back to Scandinavia, meet the Templar use the drug to power up, would be unconvinced, and if it only takes a few cursory Google searches to prove it all nonsense, the book falls apart. You're asking people to suspend their disbelief a little bit too much, especially as there's not any fabricated evidence to suggest history is wrong in the book. He didn't put anything in to make us think, oh, maybe it did happen. It's just the character's thoughts, which is very weak and unsatisfying. Secondly, this all proves that the book focused on the wrong thing. Why isn't this book about the Vikings finding the drug? You have all the conspiracy theories already with the dog, the temple and the king. Come up with a story about a small band of Norse travellers getting to South America earlier, settling, finding the drug, being chased out before they can leave too much of an impact, and that would be far more interesting. Allowing characters who are studying Norse history to find the Peruvian influences and thinking that's a bit weird, and going to Peru to find these small Norse influences, coming to that conclusion, instead of all this Templar nonsense when the Templar and the Peruvians are linked by the Vikings who barely feature. Also, how did this Scottish guy whose specialist subject is the Templars work out about this South American drug before the Mexican drug lord with far more resources at his disposal and a Harvard education who also knew the drug existed? No, the drug lord would get there first, and how in the hell did he realise the only existing plantation is in Spain? Where did that leap of logic come from? I guess we'll never know, because he's dead and Jess only realised it from reading his handwritten note on a receipt with no explanation. How did the drug make it to Spain? I suppose it's meant to be fussy and delicate, growing in the South American jungle, so how did the Vikings transport it and successfully cultivate it in Scandinavia, which is a very different climate to Peru? And how did the Knights Templar get it from Scandinavia to Spain and grow this precocious plant successfully without the know-how? How did they get it from Scandi when they didn't go to Scandinavia? And again, none of this is from deep research. It's just basic Google searches and a couple of Wikipedia articles. It's not difficult. This book came out in 2012. Google existed. The more I think about this book, the more frustrated I feel. But at least I learnt some random conspiracies about Vikings in Paraguay along the way. Goodbye.